Thank you, Speaker. It is a pleasure to stand up and speak in response to the speech from the throne. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to speak to it and to raise a northern perspective. As I've told my constituents, my initial reaction was surprise and then disappointment. Surprise because, as it appears, this government has been listening. At least they've been doing that much. They touched on a number of issues that are important to Northerners and to people across the province. But then disappointment because when you listened closely to the speech from the throne, you notice that yes, they had mentioned broad issues, just broad strokes of some of the key priorities, but there was a failure to commit, and that's what's really frustrating. So really, when you scrutinized it, it was a hollow speech and one that didn't provide much in the way of solutions to our problems. And it did touch on a number of issues, as I said. I mean, some of the issues. It committed to having an Aboriginal focus, sharing in resources, closing the gap with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children, a commitment to energy conservation. It also touched on home care, which is very big in the Northwest, youth employment, hydro prices, also something very big in the Northwest, auto insurance rates, economic development. But again, that's all it did was touch on these issues. When it comes to a vision, a plan, or even a direction, we're left looking for answers in the Premier's chair, and really what we've been left with is basically the sound of crickets, just chirping in the distance. There's no plan, there's no vision, and that's what's truly disappointing. So other than it being a desperate attempt to rebrand the same old Liberal government as a new one, we're left with hollow phrases such as, and here's some quotes that I pulled in terms of any kind of commitment in the throne speech. They were understanding and expanding access to home care, very vague concepts, protecting individuals against fraud, and working to reduce auto insurance rates, working to evaluate corporate tax compliance, and to work with partners to help young people find placements, internships, and co-op programs. Not exactly the strong language that we're looking for. Again, no real commitment to any of these really important concepts. And really what it did was it just made a mockery. That's what I felt like. I felt like I was kind of mocked. And I think the people in the Northwest felt like they were mocked. Again, there's a recognition that these are some of the issues, but it seemed as though the government wasn't really committed to making any changes. Lip service, exactly. And I was kind of left with the impression that the government knows what the problems are, but they almost seem to hope that we go to the polls quickly enough before the electorate figures out that they don't really have a plan. And, another analogy I was kind of thinking about is essentially this government is banking on the new car smell, of making the odor of the last 8 or 10 years of neglect kind of go away, and hoping that with a new mandate that we won't suffer from buyer's remorse, but that's just not acceptable. So I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about Northern Ontario and Northwestern Ontario and how this throne speech really affects our area. Truth be told, there's not a lot in this throne speech that really offers very much for those of us living in the Northwest. There's not a lot in this speech that offers much for anyone in Ontario, but for those of us in the North who are used to fighting for table scraps from the province of Ontario, there's literally nothing. Other than suggesting that Northern and rural voices will be heard, the North is only mentioned twice, and both times it was only mentioned in passing, and both... I guess that's true. And both times it was lumped in with just about every other area of this province. And to be honest, we had higher expectations, especially while the new Premier was campaigning. There was a lot of talk about Northern Ontario, understanding our issues, and really raising expectations that there would be some movement. But this Premier does claim to be, as I said, in tune with Northern voices, but she also claims to be in tune with rural voices, Southern voices, urban voices, and let's just put it this way. If you have a voice, the Premier claims to be in tune with it, and to me that's suggesting that the government continues to feel that a one-size-fits-all policy really does fit all, and that's simply not the case. There are many different regions in Ontario today, and unfortunately, we're not all being treated equally. And this is a real problem, especially in the Northwest. You can't run a government based on a we can win without approach and cater only to narrow interests that have enough power to re-elect you time and time again. And that's really the government that we've had for the last 8 years, and it simply hasn't worked. Good government looks beyond those narrow interests and governs for the whole province. It shows leadership. It goes in a direction that suits all of those who it serves. But we haven't had that type of leadership in Ontario for decades, and it's literally tearing this province apart. And the first step is to give those who are feeling disenfranchised a voice, to look at the system and to see the source of the problems. And if we do that in Ontario, we see that the problem really is the electoral system, the idea of representation by population with no attempt to compensate for regional cleavages or difference. So where it's very unjust to have one riding that can be, for instance, more than 300 or 350,000 square kilometers with more than 70 municipal councils and First Nations, and then where another riding can only be a few city blocks or a small portion of one municipality. In the Throne speech, the government does say that they will work to eliminate issues like the gas plant cancellation by doing more advanced consultation, which is a nice idea. But the better way to ensure that hundreds of millions of dollars aren't wasted on narrow partisan interests is to create a system where the government cannot be so focused on one small area of the province. 5 ridings. That really could be the balance of power. We have a system that encourages catering to narrow regional interests, and oftentimes that leads to one part of the province imposing its will on another part. Areas where they don't live, areas where they don't work, areas where they probably will never visit because they have louder voices, because they have better resources, and because the electoral system discriminates based on population. And this isn't just the case for Northwestern Ontario. It's the case for Northeastern Ontario, Central Ontario, Rural Ontario. We're all trapped in a relationship with Toronto, Mississauga, and the rest of the GTA in the Northwest, and most of us would like out of this relationship. We'd like autonomy, but we don't have the clout or the power to be in control of our own destiny. By contrast, in my region, where most of us, what we'd really like to do is join Manitoba, we could expect, if we were to do that, we could expect to have 5 or 7 ridings that would have a significant amount of influence on the legislative agenda. And we would also have a province that would represent our needs more closely. And of course, that's contrasting to what we have now, which is 1 riding. So, so what happens is when we only have basically 1 riding to represent the diverse issues and the diverse, issues that we have and concerns, we have bills that are like the Far North Act, the Species at Risk Act, where there are some narrow interests that are influencing the agenda. We need some balance. And if you break it down even further, there are rural areas that find themselves lumped in with large urban ridings, and they're just not given the population. I mean, we see that also in the north, where there are communities like Atikokan, Red Rock, Nipigon, Terrace Bay, and they're lumped in with larger centers like Thunder Bay. And so there are even some of those challenges. And what I'm saying, just to be clear, is that what we need to do is, if we can't make changes to the electoral system, what we can do is we can make changes to the legislature. And one of the best things that we could do is to create a Northern Committee, where we could have those voices that are brought forward. We could have legislation that impacts certain areas, and we could start with the North. We could maybe have other committees that represent other areas of the province, and they could, as my colleague says, kind of do a road test. See how the proposed legislation would affect these areas of the province. That's something that would be inexpensive. It's something that we could do to achieve some immediate solutions. And it's one that I strongly would encourage the Premier to go ahead with. And, it's just not acceptable for the Premier to decide that instead of doing something that would represent the democratic will of Northern Ontario, to set up a very exclusive committee made up of only a couple of people on belonging to one particular political party. I mean, that goes completely against the spirit of the Northern Committee, which would have representatives from all political stripes who would be involved. And I'm not sure if we're still going one more minute. One more minute, okay. So, again, we have an opportunity for change. The Premier has done a lot to raise the expectations of people in Northern Ontario, but there hasn't been very much that's been delivered. And really, after all of the conversations and the relationships, I mean, there's been a lot of talk of these two concepts. And after all these conversations that the Premier has had with Northern Ontario, we had really hoped that we would see some of our priorities make their way into some of the government's priorities, and we really haven't seen that.
I'd like to thank the member from Kenora-Rainy River, and I'll remind her that she has the floor when the debate resumes.